Good evening, everyone. Kalisberasis. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, and also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to another seminar brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne. Tonight's topic is Cold War immigrants, left, right, and the Orthodox Church. And we'd like to thank Jenny Proemos as our sponsor, and we encourage you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice in the course of the year. And just to remind you, if you do have any questions at the end of the presentation, simply submit them through the chat or comment section on Facebook and YouTube. We do monitor them. We're coming to our seminar series, and we hope to have our 2022 program out before the end of November. We're hoping it will be the best ever yet, with a very strong international contingent. Next week's seminar has an environmental twist and looks at the Mediterranean monk seal and endangered animal species. Hope to see many of you there. Let's move to tonight's topic. When we look at migration to Australia, the really numerically serious influx of immigrants came after World War II. A large part of this period until 1991 overlapped with the Cold War. Although there were small waves of Russian immigration to Australia prior to World War II, i.e. the 1904 Russo-Japanese War and the Bolshevik Revolution 1917, resulted in fleeing Russians seeking refuge in our southern continent. Another wave of immigrants came to Australia after the Second World War, comprising Russian prisoners of war and displaced Russian citizens. The majority did not harbor sympathies for Stalin's regime and Bolshevism, and this would probably extend to most immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. Their political sympathies mainly aligned with conservative and right-wing causes. When it came to Greek post-World War II immigration, literally hundreds of thousands arrived in the 1950s and 1960s, dwarfing any earlier waves of pre-war migration. The Greeks that came were from all over Greece, and overwhelmingly, probably over 90%, rural Greece. In 1950, Greece had an urbanization rate of 37.3%. Many were from the Peloponnese, which was relatively quite mountainous and not as fertile. Others came because they encountered governmental and bureaucratic obstacles as they struggled to make the post-war transition, as their sympathies or their family sympathies resided with the losing side of the Civil War, with the communists who dominated and spearheaded the national resistance against Nazism. Many came from northern Greece, from Kastouria and Florina, which featured prominently in the Civil War. Many of them were bilingual, some Slavophone. The departure was demographically convenient for conservative Greek governments at the time. Today's speakers, Professor Sheila Fitzgerald and Joy Damousi, will be looking at two of these immigrant groups residing at opposite ends of the political spectrum: right-aligned Russian immigrants and left-aligned Greek immigrants. More specifically, they'll be examining the role of the Orthodox Church and its interactions with these communities. By examining how the Church aligned itself politically and its role in promoting post-war political agendas, the presenters' aims are to extend the new understandings of the role of religion in new immigrant communities. Let me say a few words about our speakers tonight. Let's start with Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick. Professor Fitzpatrick came to my attention several years ago when I read her book, Everyday Stalinism, Ordinary Life in Extraordinary Times, Soviet Russia in the 1930s. And I've been an ardent fan of her scholarship ever since. She's an authority on Soviet history. Presently, she's a historian of modern Russia and immigration at Australian Catholic University, an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, and a distinguished service professor emeritus at the University of Chicago. She's currently writing a book on Soviet and Baltic displaced persons after the Second World War, and in early 2022 will be releasing a book on the shortest history of the Soviet Union. Welcome, Sheila. Other speaker tonight is Professor Joy Damousi. I think she needs no introduction to our audience. She's presented at the seminar series on numerous occasions and has facilitated our panel discussions. Presently, Joy is Professor of History and Director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at the Australian Catholic University, and an immediate past president of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Her research interests are in the areas of migration and refugee history, and the aftermaths of war. A few years ago, we were honoured at the Greek Centre to host the launch of Joy's book, Memory and Migration in the Shadow of War, Australia's Greek Immigrants After World War II and the Greek Civil War. She has a forthcoming book in 2022, The Humanitarians, Child War Refugees and Australian Humanitarianism in the Transnational World, 1919 to 1975. Joy, welcome. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for those kind words and for that introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's a great privilege and pleasure, as always, to be speaking here to the Greek community of Melbourne. And what I thought I'd do as the first speaker is to just say a few words of how Sheila and I got together to work on this presentation. So Kostas, if you could put up the slide, the second slide for me. Just number 2, that one, yeah, great. Yeah, so as Nick mentioned, Sheila and I are both historians of migration, amongst many other things we work on, but this theme has brought us together. And as Nick indicated, Sheila has done a huge amount of work on the migration of Russians to Australia, particularly after the Second World War. And Sheila's wonderful book, White Australians Red Peril, was published this year, which charts the history of migration of the Russian community to Australia, especially during that Cold War period. My own work looks at Greek migration from the perspective of the Second World War and the Greek Civil War, which explores memories of those wars within the Greek community of the first and subsequent generations. So what brought us together is the broad question of the role of orthodoxy in these communities in Australia. And we wanted to explore perhaps some of the similarities, perhaps some of the differences in the diasporic communities that we work on. And in particular, we've been interested in exploring orthodoxy during the Cold War in Australia and how this history can be written, bringing together the experience of two different communities in the Greek and the Russian communities, which are bound by the same church. Typically, church histories are written along the lines of national histories, and this, of course, is true of orthodoxy itself. And when we think about church histories, perhaps in churches such as the Catholic Church, to some extent this is true, but to some extent also these histories are often not written necessarily along national lines. So by bringing the spotlight to orthodoxy more broadly in Australia, we want to also look at how the wider political circumstances were played out between communities, the Cold War and orthodoxy. And so for this part of the talk, for my part of the talk, the questions we might ask are, what role did the Cold War play in Greek Orthodox Church affairs in the 1950s and the 1960s? Can we characterise the splits of the church itself as a form of its own internal Cold War? What connections can we draw between Greek immigrants of the left and Cold War tensions in Australia? And how did the Cold War itself impact on Greek immigrants, and what role did security agencies such as ASIO itself play in defining this experience? So these are some of the questions I want to address today. In about 25 minutes, I'll speak and then I'll hand over to Sheila. So Kostas, the next slide. So this is just a brief outline of what I'll be covering. I want to begin with a very brief overview of the Greek Orthodox Church pre-1945, followed by some comments about orthodoxy more generally during this period, and then I'll move to the more substantial part of the talk, which is on the post-45 period, looking at Cold War, orthodoxy and communism. So Kostas, the next one, thank you. So before we can explore the events of the mid-20th century, I want to just briefly look at the prehistory, that is the history pre-1945. Too often these histories are discussed separately, but I think it's worth mentioning this earlier period to provide a wider context and throw into sharp relief some of the similarities and differences that do emerge in the latter period when compared to this earlier time. So the Greek Church was officially established, as many of you will know here, in 1898 in Melbourne and in Sydney. And it is telling, I think, that these efforts were the result of attempts by the Greek, but also the Syrian and Russian communities to establish the church in both Melbourne and Sydney. And the priest Athanasios Kantoropoulos was appointed in Melbourne, and Seraphim Fokas was appointed in Sydney. So next slide, Kostas. So in Sydney in particular, the Greek Orthodox communities that had been established by lay Greeks in Australia were central in establishing the church and in running Greek affairs. The Greek Orthodox communities were the most influential and important institutions at this time. They were set up in Melbourne in 1897 and Sydney in 1898. These communities are known as the Kenotites. The Kenotites were secular organisations which were responsible for running cultural and social activities for each community. They were run by elected officials with a president and office bearers, and importantly, they established churches through fundraising and became the central organisation in community life. Priests in Australia, they believed, should be strictly limited in their activities to performing religious rituals only, and their role should not go beyond this activity. And this included keeping out of parish affairs, such as which the Kenotites are strictly and firmly controlled. So in these early years, they formed a lay community and established Orthodox religion in Australia. From 1897 until the 1950s, the Greek Orthodox community in Melbourne, for instance, was the central focus of cultural and political life. And this included church matters, and the Kenotites decided and determined ecclesiastical issues. At different times, tensions erupted over this long period, such as the decision in 1924 to begin a new structure in Australia. And this was a result of Greek churches coming in under the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. In 1924, the appointment of Christophoros Kinetis as the first metropolitan was intended to place the church in Australia under this authority, directly undermining the authority and power of the Kenotites to decide ecclesiastical matters. And what ensued was a very bitter legal and fierce split between the community and Kinetis and his supporters, which saw Kinetis leave in 1928. What was at stake here, and becomes a constant theme throughout the 20th century, was the key issue of whether it was the community, whether it was the Kenotitos, or the church which encapsulated Greek identity in Australia, who owned it, who defined it, and who controlled it in the diaspora. And this becomes an ongoing and central theme throughout the period. With the appointment of the second metropolitan, Timotheos Evangelidis, who was in Australia from 1932 to 1947, we saw that there was some harmony, at least, and some sort of bringing together of the community and the church. This was a rather temporary respite, but these power struggles did not go away, and nor did these wider issues, as we shall see as they were inflamed in the post-war period. So the point to make here is that there is a long history of splits and power struggles between the Kenotites and the Greek Church. Indeed, there is a great history that awaits to be written on these Kenotites and their role and influence in the diaspora. Okay, so next slide. Thanks, Kostas. So this theme of tension between the Kenotites and the Church I'll return to in a minute, but I just wanted to briefly dwell on the idea of cooperation between Russian and Greek churches during the interwar period and in this pre-45 time. So while the schism in the church and the community was going on in the 1920s and before, there is another parallel story to tell about the relations between the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches, and Orthodoxy in particular. And it is significant, I think, that when the foundation stone was set in 1900 to build the Greek Church in East Melbourne, here in Melbourne, there was an attendance from the Russian Consul General and Russian community members, and a message was sent both to the Russian Tsar and the Queen of Greece, informing them of this event and the attendance of both Greeks and Russians on this momentous occasion. So the next slide, Kostas, thank you. So if we look into the 20s and the 30s, and we see more of this sort of collectivity in terms of some of the combined services that were conducted between the two churches, the performance of ecclesiastical duties, and also some of the combined responses to world affairs, such as praying for peace in 1938, when the world was on the brink of war, and the collective remembrance of the war dead in 1941. So I think this marks sort of an interesting aspect of Orthodox history, and one I think worth considering more fully in terms of how Greek and Russian churches interacted at particular times throughout the 20th century. Sheila has raised with me the central question of which of the Orthodox churches was the leading church in Australia. This is a very pertinent, I think, and very interesting question. By the sheer scale of its community, was it the Greek Orthodox, or did the Russians also lay claim to leading orthodoxy? The fact that Serbian and Russian churches had a shared language may mean they may have had a wider sort of sphere of influence. The other point to make about the Greek communities and the Greek immigrants of this generation, that is pre-45, is that it was not an overtly politically active generation within the Australian community. While there were divisions between the royalists and the supporters of the nationalist leader Venizelos, Greeks considered themselves Greek patriots foremost, as many volunteered to return to Greece to fight in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, when over 500 Greek migrants returned to Greece to join the army at this time. But this political energy did not transpose onto the local setting. It was the Greeks, of course, of the generation came after 45 that were more actively involved themselves in political struggles, and I would argue this had quite significant repercussions and implications for their relations with the Greek Orthodox Church. So next slide, Kostas, thank you. So just to move now to the post-war period, and next slide. Just very briefly to continue that thread of the Greek and Russian churches for a moment, reflecting on my earlier point about sort of collaborations, there doesn't seem to be quite as much of that in the post-45 period, or at least until the 1970s, although, of course, both churches were, shared similar politics and views on wider political issues. So we could ask the question here, does what happened in the post-45 period shed light on possible shifting relations given the transformations that emerged in Australia and the world after 1945? Did the conditions of migration and the church splits and Cold War issues within communities hinder any collaborative efforts with the longer-term impact of the cataclysmic events of the Second World War? So on to slide 10, the next slide, Kostas. So as Nick identified, obviously this period was the most transformative when we look at Greek migration, and the rise of Cold War politics, and in fact the history of the church. So some of the major events after 45 was, of course, the vast scale of Greek migrants to arrive between 1947 and 1972. A total of over 214,000 Greek immigrants arrived here in Australia. This was an unprecedented number, of course, to that time, and by 1971, almost half of them resided in Melbourne. So we have a shift in the numbers. There's a new composition of Greek migrants in the post-war period. The labour shortages in Australia led to the significant growth of unskilled and semi-skilled workers in manufacturing and building, in construction industries, as well as textile industries, particularly for women, like my mother in this photo, who appears on this slide. And this profile of the working class that emerges here in Australia from within the Greek community is in contrast very much to the older communities who were largely shopkeepers and came from the islands, and many of whom had by this time established themselves financially. So there's quite an interesting class difference that emerges within the communities at this moment of these older and more recently arrived migrants. But probably most significant of all is that this generation is more overtly political than the pre-generation and has implications for Cold War politics. So large numbers of the Greek migrants who came to Australia in the early 50s had been deeply affected by the German occupation of their country and the civil war that followed. These experiences tended to have a polarising effect. In the case of many Greeks who lived through the double horrors of German occupation and civil war, coming to Australia was a chance to forget and start anew. And for many of this earlier generation of post-war migrants, the distance of Australia was not a tyranny, but a godsend. One part of leaving Europe was indeed to leave politics behind, and the further from that world, the better. While some continue to talk of politics at home or in cafes, but generally skewed any active involvement, others chose to step away from that divisive world altogether and concentrate on family and forging a life in a new, fresh world. Still, there were others who became deeply involved in politics in their new home. And like many migrant groups at the time, large numbers of Greeks remained politically connected to their birthplace through political activism. They also had the desire to politically connect within Australia. While some of these people would eventually find their way into mainstream parties, there were others who, especially in the early years of the post-war migration and due to their wartime experiences, found a more natural home in the Australian Communist Party. Communist activists grew in number with the emergence of the left-wing Democratist League, formed originally in Melbourne in 1936. The Atlas League followed in Sydney in 1939. The Pan-Hellenic Association in Adelaide in 1946, Palamas in Brisbane in 1960, Heraklitos in Wollongong, and Socrates in Newcastle in the early 1960s. These were all very much of the left and pro-communist, and there's a very long history of Greeks, of course, in political involvement that reflected this large engagement in Australian society. The Democratist League, for example, took up many causes related to issues and politics in Greece. It also served as a social club for many newly arrived Greeks. Funds from dances and socials would be sustain the organisation. The League also welcomed women. Kay Tunis became the first woman secretary of any Greek association when she was elected as its secretary. At its annual conference in 1962, the League was clear. It looked for new recruits from both sexes immediately arriving in Australia from Greece, and they sought to recruit them to the League in the early stages of their migration before they became assimilated, as they said, into Australian ideas. They were keen to take an active role in politicising Greek arrivals. The League was also very supportive of employment of migrants and agitated the Citizen Convention, the annual convention held to bring various representatives with a range of interests in migration for that task. So in the mid-1960s, political issues both at home and abroad saw the continuing scrutiny of Greek Australians by the security agencies such as ASIO. Many became involved in the anti-conscription movement during the Vietnam War, but even larger numbers became concerned with the political situation, of course, in their country of origin following the coup by the Greek military in 1967. One organisation that provided a political platform for many Greeks during this time was the Committee for Restoration of Democracy in Greece, which mobilised support against the military dictatorship in Greece, and which included significant political opposition in Australia. While both the Australian press and Australian politicians spoke out against the situation and the tactics of the right-wing junta, it was the activities of migrants, such as those involved in this committee, that caused the most concern with security intelligence and those in conservative circles watchful and wary of their actions. So next slide, Kostas. These shifts were exacerbated, these sort of political and cultural and social shifts were exacerbated by the events of the Cold War, as I mentioned, such as the Greek Civil War, as well as that of the junta. Significantly, the kinetites were often, not always, but often anti-communist, and those involved in them often held very conservative views. And so organisations such as the Democratist League in Melbourne and the Atlas Club in Sydney sought to influence them. They wanted the communities to become more actively involved in the social and political issues of the day and not simply to administer cultural and social activities. And it was apparent that during the 1950s, the Kinotites of Melbourne and Sydney became much more left-wing oriented, marshalling against anti-communist and right-wing elements within the Kinotites. The dramatic split in the church in the 1950s and beyond reflected some of these developments, of these political shifts and changes, but they also reflected efforts, again, coming back to my earlier theme, to impose new levels of church administration in Australia. The issues which arose at this time within the church shared those with the events in the 20s regarding church power. The schism of 1959, like that of 1924, was based on where authority and power lay in ecclesiastical matters. The control by lay institutions was challenged by the church again, where the Patriarch of Constantinople appointed Archbishop Ezekiel Zangalas, who'd been in the US, to create an archdiocese. The aim was to establish new Greek communities entirely controlled by the Archbishop and a new archdiocese. Establishing an archdiocese was seen as appropriate given the vast, expanding diasporic Greek community, which was rapidly and quickly making its mark on the Australian community. The shifts that were proposed were dramatic by this new shift in the church, that churches were to be independent of Greek organisations. New communities were to be established beyond Melbourne and Sydney in the outer suburbs, which were to be loyal to the Archbishop and where there was no competition from more established communities. And the cost of buying property and establishing buildings were to be let by the community. Most significant of all, the Archdiocese was to be given complete control of the clergy and religious issues. The changing relationship between the Archdiocese and these local church parishes was to introduce comprehensive control by the church. The culmination of the split occurred in 1960, of these divisions occurred in 1960 dramatically when the Council of the Greek Community of Adelaide split from the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Australia. The response was swift, with excommunication of their leaders and dip-frocking priests. Newcastle followed, also formally splitting, and Melbourne doing the same in 1962. And at that time, very dramatically and very publicly, the Archbishop was locked out of church and the disputes with the Kinotites ended in court, with the latter suing for defamation. While this split was also, these sorts of splits and divisions were also about religious practices, the underlying issue, again, was the power relationship between the communities and the Greek Orthodox Church. These tensions, which continued throughout the 1960s, also revealed other social and political fault lines of left and right, and a Greek press that was also divided on these matters. And to compound all these issues, the Archdiocese of the Greek Church was perhaps less involved and less engaged as it could have been in addressing the needs of the newly arrived Greek migrants, especially those joining the ranks of the working class. This was often left to other organisations to take up the challenge of assisting the newly arrived migrants. And the Democratic League, which grew in number during the 50s and 60s, identifies itself as the main organisation which would assist the Greek working class as they sought to integrate into Australian society. They attracted increasing numbers, particularly during the Civil War, from those who supported the leftist communist forces in the civil conflict. The church itself was involved in its own form of Cold War, of power struggles, of expulsions and exclusions, of establishing new hierarchies and driving a wedge between old and new communities. And it was certainly not immune to Cold War politics either, as the right wing actively rallied behind the Archbishop, while the left aimed to impose its influence through the Kinotites. These left and right wing tensions also came under the scrutiny of intelligence forces, and just the next slide, Kostas, which should be the last one. So ASIO spent an extraordinary amount of time, effort and energy placing Greeks involved in groups like the Democratic League under surveillance. For ASIO, the Greek communist migrant posed a threat to the Greek Orthodox Church and to the Kinotites, fearing that the communists would infiltrate both these groups and spread their influence in the Greek community, but also in the wider Australian democracy. And by way of example of this, I'll just speak to one example, which you won't be able to read that document, but I'll just refer to it here. The document on this slide is from a slightly later period, the 1970s, but it features the name of a very well-known Greek communist from the 1950s and onwards, George Zangalas, a name that will be very familiar to many of you tonight. George, as many of you know, sadly passed away earlier this year. George chose to lead an active political life in Australia. His family became active during the German occupation, and his brother joined the resistance in 1921. His father was captured by the Germans. But it was not until George arrived in Australia and he joined the Communist Party and became active in many causes relating to the conditions of migrant workers, their place in Australian society, and the needs for them to retain their cultural identity, that he was particularly active. For George, this type of political engagement connected him with both the Greek and the Australian communities, but it also drew him into the attention of the government in ways that made him a focus for ASIO. George's security intelligence file is extensive. He was political enough for ASIO to generate 22 volumes between 1952 and 1972 on his political activity. At the time of post-war migration, ASIO developed a very close and extensive relationship with the Department of Immigration. After 1951, ASIO security officers worked closely with the migration officers to monitor the activity of those considered a potential security risk. George was one of thousands of people and ASIO and organisations under ASIO surveillance. In terms of activities by Greeks and even to do with Greece, ASIO's records indicate that they had an avid interest in what was going on, including noting a widespread union support for the restoration of Greek democracy following the military coup in 1967. The Greek daily newspaper Neos Kosmos was also monitored and examined for its political articles and headlines, especially concerning during the Vietnam War. And the story that the government was contemplating migrants for national service was covered extensively in Neos Kosmos, as well as anti-conscription meetings that were reported, both of which caught the attention of the security agencies and ASIO. So the Cold War very much was impacting on Greeks and their activities in the Greek community, and we can see through this one example of George and his activism. But it's a wider story, and I think one that sort of has been under-researched in terms of the Cold War and its impact on Greek migrants. But coming back to the Church as well, this is a period of great splits and dissensions within the Greek Orthodox Church in Australia, which has its own Cold War history within the diasporic Greek community. While power struggles predated the 1959 split, as I've suggested, the resolve of those on the left in the Kenotites sharpened the wedge between the Greek Church and the communities in a new and very distinctive way during the Cold War. The activities of left-wing immigrants drew the attention of security agencies in ways unprecedented really to that time, and as they sought to impose their politics in the struggle. One of the stark differences we can see between Greek and Russian immigrants in the 1950s is the scrutiny of ASIO, of left-wing Greeks, as I've suggested here, and of right-wing Russians. And to tell us now the Russian end of this story, it is my great pleasure to pass on to Sheila.
Hello. Now I have to find how to get myself to my PowerPoint. Okay. Now, with when we turn to the Russian Orthodox Church, or rather the Russian immigrant community, we are dealing with a much smaller group. It's about the post-war migration, I'd say, is about 25,000. Now, that is much higher than the census and other statistics would suggest, and I could talk at length about why that will be, but I think I don't have the time to do that, so I won't. But that means it's really it's about a tenth of the size, is it not, of the of the Greek community. With regard, as a generalization overall, to the relationship between Russian Orthodox Church in Australia and the Greek Orthodox Church, I was surprised in the sources available to me to see that the Russians didn't seem extremely interested or concerned with that relationship. All their attention was directed towards outside Australia to the competing sources of authority in the church. That is, there were many who support the majority supporting the Russian church abroad, a minority, the Moscow Patriarchate. So let me go very briefly through some of this material. I think in my earlier, no, I didn't have, I thought I had perhaps I have coming up a slide of my book, but this is not my book, but the Michael Protopopov's, which is the main invaluable source on this question. Second World War, immigration of Russians is small. They are mainly, you have a left-wing lot. They're not going to leave a great mark on the community, but they made a considerable contemporary mark around about 1919, 1918, 1920 in Queensland. They're mainly in Queensland, mainly came via China, and the numbers are not basically reaching 5,000. So it is only a small community that the post-war immigration builds on. Now, who are these people who come after the war? Sorry about all that black ink here, but it is complicated. But basically, you've got two kinds of Russians coming under the war, after the war. One are the so-called displaced persons, who are mainly, though not entirely, from the Soviet Union, who had chosen, however, not to go back, many of them having been recruited from German prisoner of war camps to fight under German command during the war. There are also Russians from the old immigration in the displaced persons group, and essentially the displaced persons group is the one that on arrival in Australia sets up parishes with priests who have come from the DP camps in Germany and Austria, a very strongly anti-communist group. By definition, these are people who have chosen not to return. If they were Soviet citizens, they have chosen not to return. And their credentials as anti-communists were, in fact, important even for being selected for migration to Australia. Now, there's another stream of Russians who are coming from China. These are the so-called white Russians from China who'd been there since the revolution. They're people who left during the revolution and spent the interwar years in China and probably in many cases expected to stay there, but then leave with the coming of the Chinese communists. They are not, however, in general, so extremely anti-communists as the European lot, and some of their priests have served under the Moscow Patriarchate from in 1945. Yes, there's my book, the one that came out early in the year. Now here is, this is my discussion about the numbers question, but I think only the that 20 to 25,000 is what we need to pay attention to now. Now, as the Russian migrants in the post-war period are the ones who are essentially building the Orthodox community. And in a most concrete sense, they're building churches. That's really the first thing that they do as a community, and to establish community in Australia. The little church that's in the slide is in Seven Hills in West Sydney, and it was one of my oral history informants and her husband were deeply involved in its creation, and that sadly is the occasion of her funeral. That was Natalie Beige. So what the Russians do when they come is build churches, and most of their social life is around the church. And the other pillar of the new community is anti-communism. It's a particularly strong kind of anti-communism on the European part, in part because of the influence of an organization called NTS, which was an international anti-Soviet organization that basically was dedicated to the overthrow of the Soviet regime and organized all kinds of subversive activities to that end. The NTS was, the Australian NTS was also very influential in the foundation of the main Russian newspaper, which continues to this day. Now, virtually every community event is blessed by the church. And the interaction is very striking. That includes Scouts activities, important in the Russian community, and also reunions of the Vlasov army. These are people that fought against the Allies in the war, so it's quite surprising that they had reunions here, but indeed they did. Now, ASIO, Joy has talked about ASIO in relation to the Greeks. ASIO is much less interested in the Russians because they don't think that they are left-wing. There is a small group of left-wing Russians or left-wing Russian speakers, many actually not ethnically Russian, but that is definitely a minority group. ASIO pays great attention to that group, but not to the majority of the community. They had, before the war, paid a little bit of attention because of Father Antonief up in Brisbane with strong fascist leanings and fascist and pro-German leanings, and that led, it was not ASIO, but its precursor, to take an interest. But basically, with regard to ASIO, and the majority of Russian immigrants associate with the Orthodox Church, there is not a great relationship. You have, there is not a great amount of relationship. You have people, you have some people who would like to work for ASIO, who would like to use their offer their anti-communist expertise for ASIO's use, and I think it goes on some of them, but probably not as many as offered. Now, the only file I could find after the early ones about fascism from the 40s, the only ASIO file expressing anything but passing interest in the Orthodox Church was the possibility that those parishes that had been set up under the Russian Church abroad would instead go to the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. It didn't happen, but they were concerned about it. Now, in the Russian Orthodox Church in the 60s and the 70s particularly, there are conflicts, but they are not the same kind of conflicts that Joy was describing, in that there's no left there. There's a consensus on the anti-communist motif. The only way that the left might be said to come in is that in every conflict that arose in the Russian Orthodox Church, there were mutual accusations that the people on the other side were Soviet spies. But this is nothing ideological. This is, and indeed it seems to have been, to have had a certain amount of truth in that ultimately some of these priests who had professed and perhaps and seemed to be strongly anti-communist, a few of them did in fact return to the Soviet Union. Now the splits in the Orthodox Church, or the conflicts rather, they often involve conflicts between parishes, between the organization of communities set up by the laity and appointees who have come from abroad. There's a tremendous conflict that goes on between over the Strathfield Cathedral and who owns it, land and so on. Now, there's a sub-theme, as you might expect, of the European DP group versus the China group. The latter group being suspected by the former of being soft on communism and the Moscow Patriarchate. But that soft on communism is extremely relative because remember that these are white Russians too. They're people who had left Russia because of the revolution. Now, in recent developments, and I must say I knew little about these until I recently started to look into them. What is striking to me about the Russian Orthodox Church in Australia is its very strong anti-ecumenicism. And that seems to involve also a collaboration with the Greek Church, and I'd be very interested to hear more about it from the point of view of people who know about Greek Orthodoxy. In 2007, the Soviet Union had, of course, ceased to exist. And therefore, the old objection to the Moscow Patriarchate as a tool of communist Moscow no longer holds sway. At the same time, a suspicion of Moscow continues within the Australian Russian Orthodox community. Nevertheless, it is less strong than a feeling of association with the Russian Federation, the successor state to the Soviet Union. Now, in 2007, the Russian Church abroad, based in with its headquarters in New York, restored links with the Moscow Patriarchate. It remained a separate entity, but and with its title to its property and fiscal independence, although some of the accounts of this say, well, that's for now. But in any case, as of now, I think that remains. But nevertheless, it's a restoration of the unity of the Russian Church. And most parishes in Australia accepted this, although there were some breakaways. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church is notable for the extremely strong sort of nationalist quality of its thinking about most questions. I don't know to what degree that would be paralleled by other branches of Orthodoxy. But that means that in 2014, when Russia and the Ukraine were at loggerheads over the Russian absorption of Crimea and support of breakaway movements in the eastern Ukraine, at that point, the Moscow Patriarchate broke with the Greek Church because the Greek Church was prepared to recognize a new Ukrainian autocephalous church based in Kiev. And the Russian view was that any church based in Kiev ought to be subordinate to Moscow, as traditionally was. Now, not only did the Moscow Patriarchate cease to be a co-celebrant with the Greek Church, but so did the Russian Church abroad. So there was on that question full unanimity. Now I've finished off here with another bunch of statistics. Now there I simply want, as a kind of postscript, to make the point that the Australian census is a tremendously unsatisfactory medium to find out detailed information on Orthodoxy in Australia, if what you want to do is break that down into constituent branches of Orthodoxy. This is because the usual question in the census, since it was first put in there in 1954, before which there was no question about Orthodoxy, you can tick a box that marks Orthodoxy, or sometimes Greek Orthodoxy, but if you want to be more specific than that and say Russian Orthodox or Serbian Orthodox, you need to write that in. And it looks as if an awful lot of Russian Orthodox, in fact, just tick Orthodox, or as it sometimes appears in this sentence, Greek Orthodox, and don't bother to specify what. Now, yes, I see. I've reduced my presentation even more than I actually probably needed to. But let me therefore revert in conclusion to something that I didn't say at the beginning, and that is the question of the founding of the first Orthodox, or the celebration of the first Orthodox service in Australia in the early 1900s. Now, I read a Greek account of this, which is that a Greek Orthodox priest who happened to arrive on a Russian boat celebrated it, and therefore what was introduced to Australia was Greek Orthodoxy. The Russian account is different from that. The Russian account is that a Russian ship arrived and its priest, who has a Greek name, but it by implication is Russian, a Greek name is perfectly plausible in a clerical family, celebrates the first Orthodox service, which is by implication a Russian Orthodox service. Now, what in those early materials, I had been to some degree expecting to see on the part of the Russians something, what could one call it, some kind of perhaps deference to the Greek Orthodox Church as it were the senior member of the of Orthodox churches, but I didn't find anything of that kind. What I found in those early materials was what appeared to be a very strong feeling that of all Orthodox churches, the Russian Orthodox Church was the one that mattered most because Russia was a great power. Russia was the biggest power, in other words, of the very nationalist approach. Now, during the Soviet period from 1917 to 1991, of course, Russia was not an Orthodox power at all, although for much of that period, still a great power, even a superpower. But the Russian sense of the Russian Orthodox, Australian Russian Orthodox sense of being associated with a potentially very important country seemed to persist and I think to revive with the recreation of a non-communist Russia in 1991. So I'll stop there.
Okay. George, Sheila, thank you very much for those sort of presentations. The floor is now open to questions, so we encourage you all to submit your questions to the chat function or comments, and we will pick them up and I'll convey them to the speakers. While we wait for the questions to come in, I just might kickstart the questioning. Put a question directed to Sheila. Sheila, the impression I get that post-World War II Russian migration was mainly, it appears to be a Sydney or New South Wales affair. Is that correct? And why would that have been so?
Yes, mainly. Queensland had historically been the centre, and some people go to Queensland, but basically most of these Russians are coming in under the mass resettlement scheme organised by the International Refugee Organisation, and they bring most of their people to Melbourne and Sydney, where the Australian government, which had a 2-year work obligation on these people, puts them in migrant camps somewhere in New South Wales or Victoria. And so the majority, they don't stay there once they're released from their 2-year indenture, but they tend to go to the capital city of the state in which their migrant camp was. And that's, of course, where, as I mentioned, when they set up their first parish churches, they do this in the migrant camp with a priest who's a displaced person also. And then they move that into a territorial setting. But of course, it's relatively near the migrant camp where they first set it up.
If I could just ask a follow-up question. Most of my experience with Russian speakers, let's say in the 70s and 80s and sort of 90s, were mainly those of sort of Jewish origins. So there was some type of change in the migrant mix. Did did those migrants seek out contacts or relations with the existing Russian-speaking migrants that were in Australia? What were the relations between them?
If they did seek them out, I'm afraid they may have been rebuffed, because what you'd had, especially, well, the European lot of post-war Russian migrants doesn't include many Jews, because not many Jews had survived to remain in Europe displaced. With regard to the China lot, they have come from a community where ethnic Russians and Jewish Jews who are Russian speakers had interacted in Harbin and Shanghai quite considerably. When they come here, that interaction is diminished. And I think the reason is because community is being built around the church. That is, the Russian ethnic community is being built around the church. And that, of course, is discouraging for the membership of Russian speakers who are not who are not associated with the church. The Russian Saturday schools, which exist in quite large numbers in both New South Wales and Victoria, tend also to be based, all but one, I think, based in a particular Orthodox church. And so that also means that even if you're a non-Orthodox Russian speaker who wants to send your child to Saturday Russian school, you've got problems.
Okay. If I just ask a question or comment to Joy, because our audience seems to be shy tonight. They're not normally like that. When you look at the history of Greek migration in diaspora, irrespective of what country you look at, sort of Canada, US, Egypt, Africa, Australia, this conflict between the communities and the church is a constant theme. No country really sort of escapes it. And if you look at some of the histories of the Greek community, a lot of these communities in the sort of 60s and 70s, that's what they spent most of their time with this sort of conflict. The impression I'm starting to develop is, in the end, who won? I would say both lost. Why? Because, if you look at church attendance, the average age of people are probably 70 plus. If you look at Greek communities, they're probably not where they want to be in terms of language maintenance and cultural maintenance. So would you like to comment on that?
Well, that's right, Nick. I guess it's a few things. One is the whole diasporic experience. And when you transplant a cultural organisation or institution like a church, in a diasporic community, it seems to be that it ignites these sorts of divisions. I suppose I was interested in how the divisions are similar but change over time. So in the 20s, they take on a certain sort of complexion in the Cold War. As I described, they take on a particular complexion, around the Civil War, around the junta, around other political events that are happening. So, the theme is there, and it runs, as you say, through many communities, but I guess how they manifest is different. I suppose when you say who won, well, no one won at all. I think, these sort of these dramatic ruptures never end well. And I think there's been still, quite a period of following this Cold War period, a time of healing to try and get these unity between the communities and the church. But I think it's fascinating because it's reflective of, I think, a diasporic experience. Within Greece, Russia has a particular history from 17 to 91, but within Greece, how do the splits happen in the church within Greece? They're very different to the diasporic experiences. So I think it says something about the diaspora, and there's a sort of it's characterized in that diasporic experience. I think that's why it's interesting.
Okay.
Now, I have a question here on private chat. I don't know.
I was just about to ask
address
that. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, a question for Sheila. If the incoming Russian migrants were primarily right-wing, how closely were they working with the communist Soviet government at the time, managing funds, read churches, and so forth?
They weren't, because they were within the jurisdiction of the Russian Church abroad, which is in conflict with the church in Russia, which is headed by the Moscow Patriarchate. So they had no relations, financial or otherwise, as far as I know, or virtually none, until 2007, when the Russian Church abroad more or less made peace with the Moscow Patriarchate, and although retaining its separate finances. In other words, the financial relations were with the Russian Church abroad, which is based in New York.
Okay, a question from Juliana, probably aimed at Joy. How can we explain the intense interest of left-wing Greek Australians to religion and churches?
That's a very good question. That's a really good question. And it sort of gets to the heart of the paradox that, on the one hand, for many Greeks on the left, Greek identity is still tied to a religious identity. So you can be of the left but still be religious, or, engaged in religious sort of cultural activity. And this is a tension that is there, I think, throughout this history, and even with communist members, that they were culturally engaged with perhaps, the rituals of the church. So, I think you've hit a really interesting tension there about the role of religion, maybe separating religion from the institution of the church. Maybe that's a bit more productive, sort of more productive way to think about it, because the actual institution of the church, demands and has a perspective that might be not aligned politically with your own, for example, at this period. But on the other hand, that you see your Greek identity tied to, religion. So I guess it's sort of separating that out, if you know what I mean. I think there's another one there.
There's a question from Savas. I'll just read it out for the audience because they may not all be able to see it. The conflict is all about the clergy wanting total power for themselves and no power for the people, the men and women, the lay people. Is this the case in all ethnicities in the Orthodox tradition? I suppose probably, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not I can't claim to be an expert on all of them. It's a good question, though, about how the church sees its authority. I guess it's about the authority of the church and lay people. And the history I've presented tonight, suggests that there was this very long-standing struggle that took certain expressions over time. But maybe, Sheila, you want to have a go at this one, perhaps with other churches, maybe the Serbian church as well.
Oh, don't ask me about the Serbian church. I'm really not an expert on comparative orthodoxy, and it was really for the purpose of this paper that I tried to work out the relationships, and all I see the Serbian church only through the lens of comments in Russian Orthodox material, and but this is a different matter. But it is the only other branch of Orthodoxy to which warm relations seem to be indicated, sort of real brotherly relations. And this is when people comment on it, this has to do with the linguistic closeness.
Got a question has been texted to me by Nikos Papa. So yeah, this is for Joy. Can you speak to the political orientation of Greek migrants before the migration? Is it true that before migrating, they were evenly split between royalists and leftists, but on arrival, it became increasingly left-leaning?
It's a good question, Nikos. Thank you. Hello. it'd be hard to generalise on that one. I think there were royalists and there were, more left-leaning migrants who came out pre-45. Maybe there's a group that became how can I put it? Became more left-leaning, having arrived in Australia and become sort of acculturated in Australia, if you like. And I've got to say, some of the you can point to things like sort of activism in unions and so on that starts to that you see Greeks get involved in at that time, and some left-wing activity. I think there's much more research to be done on the pre-45 Greeks anyway, and their political orientation. I guess the sources we have suggest that they were Greek patriots first and foremost, that sort of thing. Having said that, some of these left-wing groups like the Democrates League and the Atlas Club, they're set up before 1945. So there are leftists here in Australia, and they're very active in setting those groups up. They're very small, of course, given the numbers of Greeks in Australia in the 20s and 30s. But certainly one to think about, Nikos. Thank you for that question.
Can I say something comparative about the Russian case? Not because one can give an answer to the question of what were the Russian immigrants of the post-war, what were their political views before they became immigrants to Australia, but rather because they almost because of the very strong convention that you start, as it were, from zero. In other words, if you're a Soviet citizen who found yourself outside the Soviet Union at the end of the war and decided not to go back, you will, from then on, say that you have been anti-Soviet from the day of your birth. But I think this is a dubious claim and reflects rather that may, at any rate, in some cases, reflect the fact that that an anti-Soviet position is the only tenable one for a person who finds themselves a displaced person who wishes to be resettled outside Europe in countries that will only take people who are free of any taint of communism, because all of them were looking for that. So there's this big this big blank, as it were, before the DP camp with relation to people's attitudes. And of course, what they say about themselves after they come, the memoirs, although containing fascinating material, by no means are they likely to say, in my youth, I was a keen young communist, of course. But this almost certainly was the case in at least a few individual cases, but nobody's going to say that.
Just got a question here from Vasilis Tsamis. Did Australian government simply prefer to deal with the Orthodox Church as the representative body of the Greek community, simply because it was a Christian body whose values were familiar?
I certainly think the government of the day, and of course, for much of the period we're talking about, it was a very conservative Menzies government, very anti-communist, very sort of Cold War warriors, many of them. There was a comfort, absolutely, with the church and, it as a representative body. I think... and it's interesting to see that so many of the splits that happen, or the divisions that happen, are very extensively covered in the Australian press. So, it's not an unknown event, and it's not unknown what is going on in the church and some of the politics I've been talking about. I certainly think the Menzies Conservative government felt very comfortable with the church as a representative body of the community, especially if some of those other Kinotites were, more left-wing than the government itself.
But don't you think, there must be a question of how much the Australian government knew about any Orthodox Church, mustn't there? And I'm struck by the fact that in the question on religion, there was no place for orthodoxy until 1954 in the census.
Yeah, I think that's
there are already 80,000 people who call themselves Orthodox. And, every tiny other denomination is in there. Huge lists of extremely small Christian groups.
I think the Greek Kenotites they're very well organised, and there's many of them in Australia. And I think what you find is, for example, in the area of social welfare, they become very active in the 50s and 60s, and they mobilise on issues of policy as well as politics. So there's a sense about the Greek community, and part of that is an understanding that the church is fundamental to it. So I think it's there, Sheila. I mean, your point about the census is a wonderful point. I mean, I think it's very interesting that 1954 that's introduced. That's really, really interesting.
It's so late. And
very late.
I mean, did the Greeks not care that they were not having an entry in the census?
The Greeks were busy fighting each other. Sorry, if I can be a bit flippant. Got a few other questions there.
I think it's more comment from Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
My issue with the Greek Orthodox Church, be left or right, is the fundamentalist view of the role of women in culture as well as the church. Has this issue, which remains silent, played a significant part in the loss of community enthusiasm? So.
Well, Liz, you could probably answer that better than I could. Well, I mean, that goes to the heart of the nature of, I guess, orthodoxy as well, and its historic understanding of the role of women, in the church and in Australian and in culture and Greek culture. I think I have to say, with my limited knowledge of this, actually, I think it has shifted. And I think the sort of third and fourth generation of Greeks in Australia have a very different relationship, I think, to the church than, say, the first or second even generation. So I'd like to think, and what I've seen, there has been some shifts on this question. It hasn't stayed static.
Are there traditionally they're convents in the Orthodox tradition, which the Russians set them up very quickly here?
What's that? Sorry, Sheila, I didn't catch that.
Monasteries for women.
Oh, okay. Yes. Now, there'll be people in this audience that could speak with great authority about the monasteries. I'm not one of them, but
there are.
But it is a form of women's presence, right?
That's true. I think Liz is talking about sort of, more progressive views and sort of about the Greek culture and so on. But absolutely, Sheila. No, they were set up and they do exist. That's true.
Because with the Russian case, I found it quite striking how quickly they jump in, how early is setting up a women's monastery on the agenda.
Where was that? Where was it set up?
In Sydney.
Oh, in Sydney.
With Sydney. I mean, there may have been one in Victoria too, but it's the Sydney one that caught my attention.
Okay. Oh, good. Yeah,
and also the fact that churches were set up so quickly by communities, it's also just for practical reasons. I mean, how do you conduct a funeral or something like that? You needed something to congregate around, because they tended to come before schools, even just for practical day-to-day reasons. And Okay. Look, we're gone well over time, so I think we might bring proceedings to a close. Thank you, both of you. Hopefully next year we can have you both at in the flesh at the Greek Centre. We've all sort of missed it. Thanks once again. Best of luck with your research. Best of luck with your books coming out next year. And hope to see you again, and have a safe rest of the year.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.